History still trembles with the shockwaves of the only two nuclear weapons ever used on a population. But one thing's become clear in the decades since they fell. There are too many things that just don't add up.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima.
In general, government officials at the time believed the bombs were a necessity to avoid a far more costly invasion. President Truman is quoted as saying, "It was a terrible decision, but I made it. I made it to save 250,000 boys from the United States, and I'd make it again under similar circumstances." But if the intention was to force Japan's surrender, the bombs might have been totally unnecessary. Evidence suggests that Japan was ready to surrender before Hiroshima. First, a personal piece of correspondence penned by Emperor Hirohito and sent to Joseph Stalin asked that the Soviet premier act as an intermediary in negotiations between Japan and the US. It's not clear when Stalin received this letter, but it was definitely before the Potsdam Conference, the meeting between Allied leaders regarding the end of World War II, which took place from July 17th to August 2nd. Hiroshima wasn't attacked until 4 days after that. On top of that, a study called the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey found that Japan would have likely surrendered before the Allies could invade. In other words, before many of the casualties that U.S. officials feared. The report was finished in September 1945 and published the next month, so after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. It should be noted, though, that historians heavily debate these points. What's not debated is the role the USSR played in ending the conflict. Whether or not Japan was prepared to surrender beforehand, the typical narrative is that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the catalyst for the end of the war. On the surface, that seems consistent. Hiroshima was attacked on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th, and Japan announced its surrender on August 15th. The timeline seems pretty cut and dry. But one thing most people don't look at is the fact that on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. That act might have a bit more weight to it than you thought. For context, the Soviet Union and Japan had entered into a neutrality pact in 1941. The agreement was beneficial to both countries because it allowed both of them to focus on fewer fronts during World War II. But as the war with Germany turned in favor of the Allies, Stalin warmed to the idea of joining in the war against Japan, even though the neutrality pact was technically still in effect. As such, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria the day after declaring war was nothing less than a betrayal. In just under a week, the Soviet army was moving on 3 different fronts against Japan, even finding success in areas of significant resistance. In discussions with his cabinet, Hirohito explicitly mentioned the Soviet Union in relation to surrender. The military situation has changed suddenly. The Soviet Union entered the war against us. Therefore, there is no alternative but to accept the Potsdam terms. We're not trying to downplay the decision to drop atomic bombs in some sort of modern-day retelling of history, but by Japan's own words, the Soviets played a major role in their surrender. With the Soviet Union on the rise, the end of World War II might be better analyzed as the start of the Cold War, as American leaders began exerting pressure on the Soviets. Though nuclear research had previously been kept secret from the USSR, Truman changed that policy as it became clear that the Soviets were poised to affect the balance of power in East Asia. The US preferred that the USSR be given as little power as possible in that situation, so Truman let it slip that American scientists had developed a uniquely deadly weapon. After all, as a deterrent, it's pointless if your enemies don't know you have it.
Whole point of the doomsday machine is lost. If you keep it a secret, why didn't you tell the world, eh?
Historians now know that the concept of a nuclear weapon had Joseph Stalin fairly concerned. Combine that fact with indications from that 1945 study that Japan would have surrendered without the atomic bomb, and you can now see how modern eyes view the bombings more as a show of force to the Soviet Union. The bombs were likely more of a show of power than a military strategy, giving the US a stronger bargaining chip when it came to post-war negotiations. Again, we're parsing this mainly on that 1945 study and the words of the Japanese leadership, and not factoring in all the other factors such as the never surrender mentality of the Japanese military and the horrific war crimes they carried out. So yes, you can blast us in the comments. Go ahead. We're just trying to show both sides here. Prior to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the US did technically take precautions to warn the civilian populations of their target cities. Airdrop pamphlets urged the Japanese people to pressure their government into surrender, making mention of an incredibly powerful weapon that they would face if the war continued. The pamphlets themselves contained intimidating images of American military might, as well as lists of cities that might be targeted for attacks. A reported 33 cities received at least one of the 3 versions of the pamphlet, each of which had a slightly different list of target cities. But 2 cities that weren't listed on any of them were, you guessed it, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Nagasaki makes sense since that wasn't on the initial list of targets, but Hiroshima is a strange omission. In the end, their citizens were entirely unaware that an attack was imminent, with reports from Hiroshima even explaining that the locals just thought it a beautiful normal day. Looking back at them today, Hiroshima and Nagasaki feel like two self-contained events relegated to their own dark shrine in history. But horrifying as it is to think about, there could have been many more bombings. See, even though the Trinity test had gone off without a hitch, the bombs slated for deployment were untested designs.
Could the bomb work? That would certainly have been the military view. We test them in action.
Scientists close to the project made a prediction about the atomic bomb's effect in a 1945 letter. In their own words, "It is doubtful whether the first available bombs, of comparatively low efficiency and small size, will be sufficient to break the will or ability of Japan to resist." Yeah, they got that one wrong. But believe it or not, even after seeing proof of their effectiveness, the US military was still ready to keep making and dropping even more bombs indefinitely. Shortly after the bombing of Nagasaki, military officials continued to make active plans for further attacks, including an outline that would include 7 more bombs deployed by the end of October that year. They were even planning the infrastructure needed to produce bombs consistently, at the rate of at least 3 per month. In a sense, it shows how the US military thought there would be no way that the Japanese would ever surrender. If there's one thing about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that almost everyone can agree on, it's that the radiation released by the bombs left thousands of people sick, and we now know what happened next.
The war ended, but not the dying. Radiation sickness would kill thousands more.
But some studies looking at survivors from the outskirts of the two cities suggest that the radiation wasn't always as damaging as commonly believed. In fact, it may have made some survivors healthier. The studies found that survivors who received low doses of ionizing radiation had a longer life expectancy and lower instances of cancer than the average population. Shocking findings, to say the least, considering everything we know about the dangers of radiation. The researchers chalked the phenomenon up to radiation hormesis, a theory that very low doses of ionizing radiation can actually be beneficial. Before you get up in arms in the comments again, we'll state for the record that organizations like the National Academy of Sciences and the United Nations don't recognize radiation hormesis as a valid theory, making these findings even more sketchy. And just to touch on one of the wildest stories to come out of the bombings, we have to mention Tsutomu Yamaguchi, who was in Hiroshima when Little Boy fell. He survived and went home to Nagasaki. On August 9th, he was telling a coworker about the bombing when Fat Man dropped.
He got 1,000 times the dose of radiation that we experienced in 1 year.
Against all odds, he lived a healthy life until he passed away in 2010 at the age of 93. Clearly, after almost 80 years to study the effects of what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's still a lot we don't understand. In the present day, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are almost always mentioned in the same breath. A series of bizarre events and remarkably bad luck led to that. In their initial plans, officials were explicitly looking for large cities of military value. They put together a short list of 4 cities that all met their criteria: Hiroshima, Niigata, Kyoto, and Kokura, now part of Kitakyushu. In other words, Nagasaki wasn't the primary target for the atomic bomb. But in June, Secretary of War Henry Stimson suddenly changed the list for reasons still debated today. According to him, Kyoto was too important a cultural center to be destroyed. There's this story that he spent his honeymoon there. We know Stimson visited the city twice in the 1920s, but it wasn't for his honeymoon. Nagasaki was bumped onto the list of 4 candidates, literally handwritten into the new draft, but still in the last spot. Things only got worse from there. Cloudy weather in the days leading up to the second bombing forced plans to change, and at the very last minute, the planes couldn't get a clear visual over Kokura, pushing the pilots to make the switch to Nagasaki on the spot. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear warfare suddenly became a prominent and enduring threat. But in a mirror effect, the bombs also brought the potential for peace. Don't forget that the military thought that a deterrent had to be proven unequivocally in a theater of war, hence Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But before the bombs were ever dropped, scientists warned that doing so would have the opposite effect. See, folks were already concerned about what the future was going to look like with nuclear weapons now on the table. So in June 1945, a group of scientists who'd worked on the project penned what became known as the Franck Report, in which they argued that springing the bomb on the world would lead to deep distrust and further conflict. Later published in the 1946 issue of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the report stated that dropping the bomb on an enemy target would shatter any trust the world had in the United States' desires for truly lasting peace, saying, It will be very difficult to persuade the world that a nation which was capable of secretly preparing and suddenly releasing a weapon as indiscriminate as the rocket bomb and 1,000 times more destructive is to be trusted in its proclaimed desire of having such weapons abolished by international agreement. Instead, they suggested detonating a bomb on an uninhabited island somewhere and inviting the world to watch, a demonstration of both power and restraint. In their words, America would be able to say to the world, "You see what a weapon we had but did not use. We are ready to renounce its use in the future." This is a theory that is often seen as a modern Monday morning quarterbacking of World War II, but obviously the controversy associated with dropping the bombs has been around since before they were used.